We're talking about culture-bound syndromes. Some cultures have different ideas about things than other cultures. I guess we can potentially talk about the taboos of the Dene people as culture-bound syndromes. I think I told you the story about getting involved with a. That didn't sound right. I got crossways with a witch up in Montana. She was my boss, and she fired me. And she was mad at me, and she said she'd like to do damage to me. Are you okay? So she put a curse on me, and about 3 days later, I had a heart attack. I know, I had a heart attack. But up there's a lot of people that claim power that potentially they don't have. But the idea up north is that if you do that, then in order for you to hurt somebody else, you have to take on the same thing twofold. Okay. So in order for her to hurt me, she had to hurt herself twice as bad. That was the idea. And I know, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would you do that? But if you really hate somebody enough, I guess you would do that. And that's what she theoretically did. And as I told you before, she came down with cancer. I know, she came down with cancer. She didn't die. She's still alive. But it aged her a lot. Cancer does that to you. And my heart attack didn't really do anything to me. I told you about that too. Anyway, there's up north, there's a lot of holy men, healers, who people claim there's. When you heal somebody, you can either do good things or you can do bad things with your power. That was the idea. And so there's a lot of people that claim that there are people up north that have gone to the dark side rather than the good side. Really kind of an interesting argument. I tried not to get involved with that, but I didn't really have much choice since the witch cursed me, or at least that's what she said she did.
She said she did?
She told me, she said, I would kill you if I could.
Oh.
Because I did something horrible. I didn't listen to her. She told me not to do something, and I did it anyway. What a monster I am. I know. I'm a horrible, horrible person. What's going on? Anyway, now here I am talking about the crazy lady in my computer report. What does that mean? Oh my goodness, what's happening? The lady had a PhD, and she claimed she was still a witch. Had a neighbor that was a clown, Nakota. He was a Nakota clown. You guys don't have clowns. Do you have clowns? Do you have clowns? Clowns? You have dancers, but do you have clowns? And the Dakota people, among the Dakota people, the clowns are the police force. And nobody knows who they are. They wear masks, and they wander around, and they do things like, let's say that a lady is living with a man that she's not supposed to be living with. They'll go into their teepee. This is when the buffalo hunt. They go into their teepee and they throw all the stuff out of the teepee. Or they would rip all of her clothes apart because she's being adulterous. And that's how they would do it. It's almost like a joke, but of course it wasn't a joke. They were really serious. Anyway, they were supposed to have magical powers as well. So once upon a time, I had a student that thought she was in love with me, and her boyfriend was a clown. And theoretically, they have all this power. So she said, be careful. I know how much power he has. And I'm thinking, I'm not doing anything. Why are you doing this to me? I wasn't doing anything. But he thought I was. Or she thought I was. And I don't know. Anyway, nothing happened. He was a friend of mine. Great. He became a friend of mine. And like I said, nothing happened. Certainly nothing happened. Why am I getting all these pop-ups? Anyway, so we're talking about culture-bound potential problems that people have. And we talked about DOT. DOT is a problem in among half the world's population. They believe that it happens in India, where they have 1.2 billion people, and the Chinese have a form of this as well. So that's what, 1.8 billion people. So that's like 3 billion people.
When you stand right there, everything is okay. I won't see you.
Okay. Did it again. So you're right. It's me.
Yeah.
It really is. Oh no. We talked about Hikikomori, where people become hoarders. Oh, Jesus. You know whose fault this is? Marius. He's got the good one. Yeah, I know. He's got the good projector, so he left me with the bad one. Come on. Pick it up. There you go. Hikikomori. There we go. We talked about Hikikomori, where people they don't interact with other individuals. As confusing as all that is, they don't and this is in Japan, where everything is so crowded, so ridiculously crowded. But they cloister themselves in their room, and they hoard things. They collect things, video games and whatnot, and that's what it looks like in Japan. As you can see, she's got all these stuffed animals over here. I'm not exactly sure what this is. Looks like some hoarding problem. And we talked about bulimia, vomiting so that you stay slender. Something everybody wants to do. My wife, for example. If I come back like on Friday, you know what happened. My wife got so pissed off she sent me away. Eating disorders affect many people in the West, but there are some nuances when it comes to determining universality of these conditions. Bulimia appears to be a culture-bound syndrome because rates have increased over time, and the age of the people being diagnosed with bulimia has gotten lower over the years. We are seeing it in elementary schools. It is also more prevalent in some societies, particularly those with Western influences, than in others. In particular, it is absent in most cultures of the world, especially in cultures where food, of course, is not abundant. So a lot of people think it's a culture-bound syndrome. Anorexia nervosa, however, it may or may not be one. This is where the person has a distorted idea of what they look like. Now, actually, if we go back in time, and we go back to the medieval times, when people were extremely religious and the church controlled like everything in society, there were a lot of women who decided that the best way to be as holy as they possibly could be was to limit the amount of food that they took in. So they didn't eat very much. We actually, for a while, we saw this in some nun populations, where these individuals would give away food, and they would give away their own food, and then they weren't eating enough to keep themselves alive, so they were becoming anorexic. So some of the groups of nuns, and you can look this up as to which ones did this type of refusal to eat, or refusal to do anything. There are groups of nuns that don't speak. There are groups of nuns that eat very sparingly. or they eat only, they're vegetarians and they eat only select plants. They don't kill things. They eat only select plants, as confusing as this is. Evidence of culture-bound status, huge increase in the rates of anorexia this century, primarily found in only some cultures, especially the American culture, of course. Evidence of universality, reports of self-starvation in numerous cultural contexts, but not due to body image. And of course, that's what anorexia is. It is the body image. This lady, the reason she's doing a selfie when she is so slender is because she's so proud of the fact that she has lost this weight. There is a website, Facebook page, where the individuals, and they talk about how they lose weight, how little food they ate, and of course they're putting all this online, and the girls are showing each other pictures of how slender they are, as stupid as that sounds, and then they die. So there you go. I know, it doesn't sound very smart, does it? As with bulimia, rates of anorexia have significantly increased over time, and it is absent in many cultures. However, it has been found in cultures that have very little Western influence, and it also manifests differently in some other contexts as well. Symptoms resembling anorexia have also been noted amongst ascetics who refused food for religious reasons, and in the 17th and 18th century among teenage girls who starved themselves to model themselves after the ascetics. And these ascetics, of course, and if you go to India today, you can wander around in India, and what you will see is select holy men who fast, and they will fast for a week, or they'll fast for 10 days. So these individuals are very, very slender. Not only that, but they don't wear any clothes. Jainists, for example. Jainists are an interesting group of people. They don't want to kill anything, and they can't work. So their symbol is the begging bowl. People give them food. And the other is the broom, because they sweep the sidewalk in front of them so that they don't step on any insects. How cool is that? My symbol is the begging bowl and the broom so that I don't hurt anything. And of course, if you wander around India, you see these naked men from time to time, and very slender naked men. And of course, these are the ascetics that they're talking about. Some of these are Jainists who never move. And the reason they don't move is because if they do move, they're afraid they'll hurt something. And these are Jainists. A little odd to see somebody naked. Now the reality is, if you have ever been to India, has anybody ever been to India? No? We've got no Indians in here? Just kidding. We have nobody from India. If you go to India, if you've ever watched a Bollywood movie, I'm sure you didn't see anybody kissing anybody else. You probably didn't see anybody touching anybody else, because that isn't appropriate as far as people in India are concerned. You also didn't see very much skin. You didn't see very much, there's certainly no nudity in Bollywood movies. But here we have these individuals that are just sitting there without any clothes on. They're usually on a corner somewhere. And of course they've got their begging bowl in front of them. That's how they eat, is by people giving them food. But they don't have any clothes on. That sounds a little weird. I guess Western men, the only time we don't have any clothes on is if we go to a nude beach, of course. Yeah. Otherwise, we wear clothes. And here we have the Indians that never show any skin whatsoever, and there are some select individuals that don't wear clothes at all, as confusing as that is. And this is a picture of Mahatma Gandhi. You may have heard of Mahatma Gandhi. Very interesting fellow. He was an ascetic, and he was a leading force in getting the Hindus and the Muslims to make peace after the English pulled out of. He was trying to get the English to leave India. Is what he was trying to do, and he was successful. But then, of course, the Civil War started between the Muslims and the Hindus. Who was going to take over? And the answer what happened in India was that the Hindus took over, and most of the Muslims went to the corners. They went this way, and some of them went to Pakistan, and the others went to what used to be East Pakistan, but what is now Bangladesh. But he was an interesting person. He was an ascetic, and he tempted himself. And the way he tempted himself was to sleep with young girls. He slept with young girls. He was tempting himself. He was an ascetic. He wanted to show how holy he was. And he did this by sleeping with young girls. Not having sex with them, but laying beside them and not having sex with them. As confusing as that may sound. And that's the reason why this picture is here. Because he was an ascetic, and he was showing everyone how strong his will was. That doesn't make any sense to anybody, does it?
Like the polygamous,
I'm sorry?
just one you got the men that marry multiple wives.
Oh, polygamist. No, they have sex with everybody. No,
No, they marry multiple women to be like God.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, sometimes polygamists or any person that is a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, a lot of times they will marry what they refer to as spiritual wives. As the way it works, does anybody understand Mormonism? Does anybody have Mormon? Okay. This is the way it works. Only men can go to heaven, but they can take women with them. So they'll take their wives with them. So if you're married, if a female Mormon is married to a male Mormon, then she will get to go to heaven. Now what happens is there's not enough men to go around. So men will marry, they'll marry other women, but it's only she's only his spiritual wife. It's not really polygamy. And they have to do this because when Utah was becoming a state, one of the criteria was that they get rid of polygamy. So that's the reason that they got rid of polygamy, was so that they could become a state. But they have solved their problem of women going to heaven who aren't married by creating this spiritual wife situation. Does that sound about right? Have you ever heard of that? I don't know. That's from like 15 wives.
There's different things I heard about where the church split apart on 3 different ways.
Yeah.
And then I think one of them is like, the main one is probably the ones with the temples.
Right.
And the one that's probably barely hanging on are probably the ones that are with churches with polygamy involved. And the lowest one is probably not even on the charts. Probably have like illegal stuff in it.
Right, potentially. And that's Jeff's.
I know one of them had wives, and I guess they had like something going on.
Well, they were marrying, he was marrying underage girls.
Yeah.
That was a little
They
hard.
caught him.
Jeff. Yeah, he's in prison, but his son has taken over the church. Yeah. But it seems to be only one town.
His father was something like the high priestess.
Right.
And then when he passed away, he gave it to him. That's when he kind of corrupted the whole thing.
Right.
And that his son.
Now the problem, I guess this isn't a real problem, but most Mormons live in Utah, Nevada, and Idaho. But all the splinter groups seem to be down here. So, and on the border, they're all right there. Anyway, yeah. So what am I talking about? Oh yeah, the spiritual wife thing. Okay, all right. So you can marry somebody without ever having consummated your marriage. Carro. Carro is. Ooh, where'd it go? You can thank Marius for this. So I'll go down and beat him up. No. He drove his old beater truck again. He's got a brand new truck and he won't drive it. Does that make any sense, having a new car that you don't drive? Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, if you want to keep your warranty for a while, if it's under $70,000.
Well, theoretically, you're supposed to drive your car 20. They estimate that you're going to drive your car 20,000 miles every year. There it is. Okay. I'll stay over here. Carro is a morbid anxiety about one's penis shrinking into one's body. This is a problem that males have, obviously, because only males have penises. Primarily found in South and East Asia, it is unclear what aspects of the culture have led to the emergence of Carro. But it's this really amazing anxiety that these people have. But of course, we also see it in the United States. In America, we see it with people who have a negative marijuana-induced experience. They will fear, they will have anxiety that their penis will disappear for some reason. They have just started selling marijuana in Massachusetts. Recreational marijuana. So we'll have more people that think their penis is going to disappear, which is always exciting. Carro epidemics of panic, anxiety due to widespread fears of losing one's genitals, procreative ability. Not only are you losing your penis, but you're also losing your ability to reproduce. And some individuals feel that they're going to lose their life at the same time. So as slowly your penis is disappearing, and of course you can't reproduce. Eventually, of course, it's going to kill you. This fact that your penis has disappeared. In China, it is caused by the female fox spirit, and this is what the Chinese female fox spirit looks like. This is one of the reasons why men in China are so afraid of foxes, because no matter whether the fox is male or female, they always see them as the female fox spirit. And if they see one and the fox does not run away, the fox isn't afraid of them. They're afraid that the fox is actually a fox spirit and not a fox. And that it's actually a female that will give them Carro, will make their penis go away. In Singapore and Thailand, they assume that the reason that this is happening is because of a mass poisoning. In Africa, of course, and we saw this in the last chapter, we saw the Azande, the women with the witchy eyes, with the big dark eyes. They feel that it's sorcery that is causing the problem. And of course, anytime there is socioeconomic or political tensions in certain sections of Africa, then Carro is what happens in that area. Today, in contemporary Western societies, ideas of genital disappearance are not culturally endorsed, but historically, it should be remembered that in the late Middle Ages in Europe, a man could lose his virility through magical attacks by witches. That was the idea. Now, if you remember, if you've ever read anything about the Salem witch trials, you may have been going, "What? Who cares? Who cares what's going on? You know, that there are witches here. They're not going to bother me." Well, the men, and it was the men that hung these women, and there was a couple of men that they hung as well. But the reason that they were so afraid, it was because they were afraid that the community would lose their ability to reproduce. They would lose their ability to produce children, and then the community would die. That was one of the reasons why the Salem witch trial was so extreme, that they hung these people, is because they were afraid that their penises would go away. The conclusion is that the psychological disappearance of the penis is a universal syndrome that was described recently in Asia and Africa and already in the medieval Europe. So this is very common in Europe. Now remember, one of the things that was happening in the Middle Ages was a very religious time in Europe. And one of the things that was going on, there were women that were leaving their communities to go into to become nuns. There were huge influxes of women joining the order, or joining this order, or joining that order. There were also men that were leaving the community and becoming monks or priests. I mean, there were just huge masses of these individuals. The church was the leading owner of land in Europe. And for this reason, of course, there was a lot of this going on. There was a lot of these ideas. Of course, if a woman became a nun, then she pledged herself. She became the bride of Jesus, which is what happens when you become a nun. And of course, you're not going to have a baby. You don't get to have babies after that. And of course, the men, sometimes they left for one reason, or they left for another reason. And of course, it was a very strange and difficult time in medieval Europe. There was famine all over Europe, and the only food was food that the community had to give to the abbeys, as weird as all that sounds. So there were people starving to death in the communities, and of course they were considered, they didn't know if they would go to heaven or not, but the people that became nuns and monks, those individuals knew that they were going to get to go to heaven. Of course, all of this eventually evolved into something completely different. The religion became less powerful, and the royal families of Europe seized the religious lands, and that was part of their riches, of course, as confusing as all that may be. This is something that our soldiers ran into in the South Pacific. It's called amok. It's an acute outburst of unrestrained, violent, and homicidal acts preceded by brooding, followed by exhaustion and amnesia. It is most common in Southeast Asia. So as our soldiers were fighting in World War II and in the Korean War and in Vietnam, they ran into people that would just go berserk. The Vikings had a form of this. They called it berserking. They became berserkers. These individuals would get a bloodlust, and they would kill anything in front of them. So hopefully they were in the front, and they were, the other soldiers are going, here, go out in front, and they would go berserk, and no one could kill them, and they would just kill everybody that they came in contact with. This may result from having no acceptable means of expressing your frustrations, of course. So we saw it in especially during World War II, we saw it with select natives of the South Pacific. We didn't see it so much in Vietnam, but we saw it especially during World War II. This is something that Freud identified, hysteria. Hysteria is a commonly diagnosed condition in the 19th century Europe among women. They think that probably it had something to do with the repressive Victorian culture that was taking place at that time. Women who lived in the Victorian era wore dresses that came up to the top of their neck. They couldn't show any neck, they couldn't show any wrists, and they couldn't show any ankle. So if you read a book from the 19th century and dealing with the Victorian era, then men would become excited if they saw a woman's foot. Not her naked foot, but her foot with a shoe on it, because they could guess what the shape of her ankle was if they saw her with her wrist uncovered, or with her ankle uncovered, as confusing as that is. I know. So she's getting into a into a carriage, and she lifts her leg up, and he can see. And their dresses would scrape the ground. So they couldn't even, they had no clue what this lady actually looked like. I mean, any woman actually looked like. But then if she looked at the hem of her dress and they actually saw her foot, then they'd get all excited.
Bruce, the word that I went to Europe, the Vatican, you couldn't, people with little short foot, they had to be up to here.
Oh.
So you couldn't show your unique Knees.
Good to show your knees.
No,
I
so
want
yeah,
to see a
in
lady's
Canada, they
knees.
used to wear these people on the side sell these paper pants.
Oh, really?
So they were kind of making that sound that. People would take, especially if you're a tourist and you're out there with trunks, and you'll buy one's $10 or something. One tourist help another tourist, take off your pants and give it to the next
Oh.
tourist.
Cheated that guy out of $10.
Yeah.
Good work. Or you could sell it for $5. See? Make a profit.
Like the Vatican. In front of the Vatican.
As weird as that is. Did we ever have a president that was like that? Richard Nixon wouldn't allow women to be in his presence unless they had a dress on. If they had slacks on, then he wouldn't allow them in his White House. If he were there, they could work as long as they didn't see him or he didn't see them. But if they were in his presence, they had to wear a dress. Now you may think that's kind of backwards, but he was a Quaker. Nixon was a Quaker, which seems a little odd since he joined the Navy during World War II. He actually went to war. Not sure how much combat he was in, but anyway, Richard Nixon had the same idea of covering yourself. Symptoms include temporary blindness, insomnia, fainting, and loss of appetite for food and sex, of course. One of Freud's most famous case studies dealt with a woman who, I told you this, she went blind because she saw her husband's penis. So she went hysterically blind. Another lady moved during sex, as evil as that is, and she became paralyzed from the waist down because she actually moved during sex. So the hysteria, that was hysteria. And this was very common. So you have to ask yourself, we look at Freud, we read Freud, and we go, oh, that's crazy, none of this was ever proven. But the reality was he was running into this stuff every day. So he was dealing with something totally alien from what we see today. So you really can't attack Freud. And it's one of the reasons I think that we should be teaching Freud, was because he was dealing with something very specific. He's dealing with 19th century problems, mental illnesses, and one of them was hysteria, and it was all over the place. He lived in Vienna, Austria. Vienna, Austria was the sex capital of Europe. What does that mean? Well, there were a lot of prostitutes there. It was very common for people in the Victorian era to be married to a woman that they reproduced with, but also to have mistresses. These were individuals that, of course, you could only do select things with your wife, so they would have mistresses that they would do other things with. They would have other types of intercourse with. Sometimes they actually reproduced with these women, but it wasn't all that common. If you've ever seen the movie Gigi, which is about the French cabaret society of the 19th century, that's what was going on. Gigi, of course, some guy falls in love with her. She's only 17 or 18 years old. Cafe Society, I'm sorry, not the Cabaret Society, the Cafe Society. She is the product of some man, and her mother was his mistress. They were never married, and of course, this was acceptable behavior in France at that time. This is in Paris. And eventually, she falls in love with this guy falls in love with her. They have to decide whether they will get married or just her be his mistress. She loves him so much, she's willing to be anybody for him, and of course, eventually he marries her, and that's the movie Gigi. But this was a whole society that was built on this. So if we look at England, we see the same thing. If we look at France, we see the same thing. And the reality was, if you went to New York City at this time, we saw exactly the same thing. So we had people that maintained mistresses. On the Titanic was one of the Vanderbilts was on the Titanic, And he didn't have his wife with him. His wife was back in New York City. He had his pregnant mistress with him. And they both drowned on the Titanic. It wasn't his wife, it was his mistress, his pregnant mistress. And unfortunately, of course, both of them died. But I mean, this is in polite society. You didn't talk about Nancy Jones, because Nancy Jones was the mistress of Charlie, whatever. Anyway, you didn't talk about her. You didn't even mention her name, despite the fact that she lived in a nice apartment and she had all this money and whatnot. Very weird. Anyway, hysteria. So there was a lot of sexual repression that was taking place. Women weren't allowed to have a good time. Only men could have a good time. And because of that, if the woman did have a good time, then she potentially would start suffering some form of hysteria, as it were. Phrygophobia. Phrygophobia is the morbid fear of catching cold. Not getting sick, but just being cold. They fear being cold. So these individuals will wear down jackets in the summertime. They will wear a hat covering their ears. You'll never see them without a hat on. Wait a minute, there are people that wander around with stocking caps on all the time, right? Even in the summertime, they have stocking caps on. It seems a little odd. It's found largely in China. China, of course, is a lot like the United States. It's a relatively large country. The northern portion of China is very cold. Up near Mongolia, it's very cold up there. On the other side of the Great Wall of China it's pretty cold. But southern China is fairly warm. People they not only avoid cold air, but also eating cold food because they're afraid that it will make them cold. They dress in several layers of clothes. This disorder has been linked to other psychological disorders such as hypochondriasis and obsessive compulsive disorder, phrygophobia. So these individuals have a coat on all the time, even in the summertime. That sounds like me. I wear a coat in the summertime. Well, but I do sweat. Phrygophobia may be culturally linked to Carro. Men, when they get cold, of course, their penis retracts to some extent. So, of course, this is something that they see. Where the disorder causes male sufferers to feel their penis is retracting into the body due to an insufficiency of male element. And this is the yang. The white portion is the yang. And the female portion is the yin, the black portion. The male portion is represented by the sun, and the female portion is represented by the moon. So the yin and the yang. The yin, of course, is the female portion. Male phrygophobia sufferers correlate coldness with an overabundance of the female element, or the yin. That's the black stuff. That's the black portion of the circle. Okay, all these fun stuff. I know, Carro and phrygophobia. Don't ever go to China, they'll drive you nuts. Susto is a frightening condition in which a person thinks their soul has been caused to become dislodged from their body, causing a variety of physical and psychological symptoms. It's primarily found in Latin America, so it's Central and South America. Susto. And if you scare somebody, which is a kind of a mean and cruel and evil thing to do, but if you scare somebody, potentially their soul will become dislodged from the rest of their body. I know, so don't do it. Among the indigenous peoples of Latin America, in which this illness is most common, susto may be conceptualized as a case of spirit attack. So they feel that it's not just you scaring them, but also a spirit that is dislodging their own spirit, their own soul. Symptoms of susto are thought to include nervousness, anorexia, because you are afraid that you're going to be afraid, insomnia, listlessness, fever, depression, and diarrhea. And it's very common among the indigenous peoples of South and Central America. And of course, those are indigenous peoples of South and Central America. Voodoo death, you've probably heard of voodoo, you've seen the cartoons, I mean there's a lot of fun stuff. If you've ever watched anything about New Orleans, usually they talk about voodoo. Voodoo death, the person is convinced a curse has been placed on him or her, or he, she has broken a taboo. Voodoo has lots and lots of taboos. Don't step on a crack or you will break your mother's back. Those types of taboos. You can't walk in a spider web shadow. You can't, if you see a spider walk across the ground, you can't walk behind it. If it's already walked there, you have to walk in front of the spider. You can't walk behind the spider. So you can't step over where a spider's been. Fun stuff like that. Results in if you've broken a taboo, it results in severe fear reaction, which may lead to death. It's mostly found in Africa, but it's also found in the Caribbean and especially in Louisiana. Louisiana was an interesting city. Louisiana was a southern city. Louisiana initially belonged to the Spanish. Then it was taken over by the French, and then eventually it was taken over by the United States. But it belonged to a lot of different people. Now, one of the interesting things about New Orleans, the history of New Orleans was kind of an open city. Miscegenation, not miscegenations, that's not the right word. Wait a minute. Black people and white people weren't allowed to reproduce. Is that miscegenation? The miscegenation? Yeah, it's miscegenation. Black people and white people weren't allowed to reproduce. It was illegal for a white man to have to produce a child with a black woman, or vice versa, a black male and a white female. That was against the law. Every place except in New Orleans. New Orleans was an open city, and one of the reasons people were afraid to go into New Orleans is because of voodoo. It became very powerful. Individuals that came in and tried to arrest women that had had sex with men, black women who had sex with white men. Strange things happened to the people that came in to arrest those individuals. And of course, they practiced voodoo in that town. Eventually, of course, there were a lot of what were referred to at that time as mulattoes. Mulatto means that the individual has both white and black ancestry. They even had special names for all of these individuals. So if they were only one quarter black and they were 1/4 black and 3/4 white, the individual was referred to as a quadroon. And if they were 1/8 black and 7/8 white, they were referred to as an octoroon, as strange and odd as that may seem. Another term that they used for anybody that was considered a mulatto was a maroon. They referred to them as a maroon. So if you hear the term maroon, and this isn't recognized very, very often today, the fact that they were using these terms, so from time to time you'll see a team that their mascot are the Maroons. They're called the Maroons. University of Chicago are called the Maroons. So what are they talking about? Are they talking about the color maroon, or are they actually talking about somebody who has African ancestry? That's the question. And of course, nobody wants to answer it because people pretend that the term doesn't mean what I just explained to you that it means, as odd as that may seem. So if you go to New Orleans today, you will see a lot of individuals that have white and black ancestry, and maybe they have only very little black ancestry, but it's really kind of curious. Anyway, so voodoo, of course, because voodoo theoretically protected the city, the individuals that wanted strong social control weren't able to do that. Another term that they used to refer to an individual that had some African ancestry was yellow. They referred to them as yellow. So when they sing about the yellow rose of Texas, what they're really talking about is they're talking about a prostitute who had some black ancestry. However much, we're not exactly sure. Anyway, that's what they're talking about, as odd as that may seem. So the Yellow Rose of Texas, which is one of the primary songs from Texas, is actually about a prostitute who has some African ancestry. As curious and odd as that may seem. All this information is just, where did I get all this stuff? I know. And why am I talking about it? The anomaly of voodoo death is recognized as psychosomatic. So if you think you're going to die, you will die. And it's psychosomatic. I mean, you can die from, if you believe that you're going to die, then you will die. As somebody who's seen a lot of people die, I can tell you that people will hang on as long as they want to. And when they decide that they're tired or they don't want to hang on anymore, they'll just go. That's just the way it works. I've watched it over and over and over and over and over again, unfortunately. Okay, so it's psychosomatic in that death is caused by an emotional response, often fear to some suggested outside force. And of course the outside force in this case is voodoo. Voodoo death is particularly noted in native societies and concentration or prisoner of war camps, but the condition is not specific to any particular culture. So voodoo is a very common idea all over the world. Lata is a transient dissociated state brought on by a startling event, followed by engaging in culturally inappropriate behavior, after which the person has no memory of the episode. Well, that's kind of nice. It's kind of like being drunk. You can do anything you want when you're drunk, and a lot of people do. They just do the stupidest things that you ever saw. Put a lampshade on their head and dance around, or whatever, I don't know. They go out on the dance floor and think that they're dancing. In reality, they may not remember it, but of course, they think that they can do whatever they want. It's found primarily in Southeast Asia, but also in Siberia and amongst the Ainu of Japan, Lata. Of course, it has different names in different places. When surprised, the affected person typically engages in such behaviors as screaming, cursing, dance movements, and uncontrollable laughter. And they will typically mimic the words or actions of those around them. In other words, they start mimicking people around them. Physical symptoms include an increased heart rate and profuse sweating, but no clear physiological source has been identified. Lata. And a lot of times they will claim that they have blacked out. Some people claim that they black out when they get drunk. I don't know. Obviously, evidently it happens because people don't remember what they did the night before. Some people wake up and there's somebody next to them and they go, oh my goodness, who is this person? That's never happened to me, but I'm sure it's happened to other individuals.
Barb.
Is this good news or bad news? Malgry is a concern that one has been invaded by totemic spirits that makes them sick, tired, and drowsy because they entered the sea or a new territory without having engaged in the appropriate ceremonial rituals. And this is primarily in the Aboriginal world of Australia. So these individuals, they have different things that you have to do when you go to a different area. You have to perform a select ritual in order to go into that area so that whatever the force is that is protecting that area does not infect you. And that's the idea. So you have to do select rituals in order to go in there. Kind of like the Vatican. You can't wear short pants or something horrible will happen to you.
I got it. My family took a trip to the west coast, the beach.
Okay.
And in some tradition with regards to, I don't know how Charles can correct me on this one, if you see the below body of water, the ocean, you're supposed to do a beam.
Okay.
And before you go into it. And my mother went on this trip with them, so She did it for my sibling before he went to the water.
Okay.
But the in-law, he's not native. He ran right into the water, and they were trying to tell him, wait up, let's go do this first. And he ran right straight in. And
Drown.
I don't know what he did to his toes, but his toes are now like this.
Is that right? Write that down so that we don't do that.
His toes were like,
Yeah. My God. Oh no. So now his toes are curled up. Oh, that's ugly. Anyway, so you got to do the right rituals in order to go into select areas. Of course, as far as the Aborigines of Australia are concerned, Australia, how big is Australia anyway? Does anybody know how big that place is?
size of Texas.
Size of Texas?
Twice as Texas.
Twice as big as Texas. That's pretty big. Is that how big it is? Same size as the United States. I know, you don't think of it as that big. There's not that many people there. Of course, most of Australia is like toxic. You can't. The plants there are more poisonous plants and animals in Australia than there is in all the rest of the world. It's the most toxic place on earth. It's very dangerous. And of course, I mean, knowing that, then this whole idea that each area of Australia is protected by a different totem. I mean, you can eat this plant here, but if you go right next door, then you can't eat that plant. It's got too much poison in it. You'd have to know that. And of course, the Aborigines have this kind of knowledge. And of course, that may have something to do with all the totems, the things that are protecting those areas. How am I doing on time? Okay. Agonias is Spanish for the agonies. Agonias is an anxiety disorder that includes a burning sensation, a loss of breath, and sleeping, loss of sleeping, among other symptoms. Primarily, it's found in Portugal and the Azores. Azores is a group of islands in the Atlantic Ocean. It's right off of the coast of Africa. Those are the Azores, and the Azores, of course, belong to Portugal. We just happen to have a base on one of the Azore Islands. Lodges is an American base. We have an American base there, American Air Force base. As interesting as that is. Anyway, so we actually have a presence on the Azores. Uh-oh, I lost something. Oh no. It went away. Okay, what else happened with Agonias? The agonies. The problem with the agonies, and the reason these people have a problem is because they are worried, and they're worried not only about themselves, they're having a bodily reaction to worrying about the community, to worrying about the church, and to worrying about their neighbors. So they're worried about individuals, they're worried about the entire community that they live in, and they're also worried about insulting the church. So these individuals they don't sleep. They spend all their time worrying about things. And they worry about like everything. And of course it's really hard to put all these things together. If you're counseling somebody and they have a spiritual problem, that's one thing, but here they're also worried about people in their community, individuals, plus the community itself. So it's like everything is bothering them. Their entire life is bothering them, as confusing as that is. So the spiritual part is really kind of interesting to me. Now, of course, once upon a time we had a problem with the church. The church was very encroaching on just about everybody's life, but we don't have that anymore. Yet these individuals, they still suffer from worrying about whether they will go to heaven, worrying about whether the community will survive, and worrying about their next door neighbors at the same time. They worry about everything. Profunga sisa is anxiety and somatic problems associated with mental exhaustion stemming from too much thinking. Primarily it's found in Africa, the Caribbean, Native Americans, and East Asians. And the worry is, that the problem is that people are worried about, they think too much. And of course, there's nothing worse than thinking too much. So they lose sleep over because they think too much, as confusing as that may be. Attacks des nerfs, feeling palpitations, numbness, and a rising heat sensation during emotionally charged situations such as funerals. Normally, of course, funerals are a subdued time. People don't really get that excited during a funeral, but the attack of nerves is what it's called. These individuals will have an extreme reaction to something that is emotional. This is very common in Puerto Rico. I had a friend that was Puerto Rican. He was married to a lady up north, and so he lived on the reservation. But he was a very emotional individual. Anytime he went to a powwow, he would, if he started dancing, of course they have intertribals. If you've ever been to a powwow, you know what I'm talking about. They'll have an intertribal, and he used to dance during the intertribals. And sometimes, not every time, but every once in a while, he would just start dancing, and he was like the Native American church drum. You know, they're beating really fast, then all of a sudden they start beating faster. That's what he would do. He'd start dancing, and then all of a sudden he starts dancing really fast, and passing everybody, and just kind of like running around the, I know, it was really bizarre. But it was one of these type of deals. It was an attack of nerves. I saw him do it twice. Once during the summer, and once during a winter powwow. It's just the most bizarre thing in the world. And of course somebody had to go out and stop him, and his wife was so embarrassed. And his kids were laughing on the sidelines. It was just so bizarre. Nice guy, just the nicest guy in the world, but and every once in a while, he'd go out there and dance like everybody else, but every once in a while, he went berserk. Universal syndromes highlight the biological basis of these psychopathologies. Still, prevalence and manifestations of these disorders may differ across cultures. These are the universal syndromes. The DSM-5, the major depressive disorder, MDD, diagnosed given 5 of the following 9 symptoms. Major depressive disorder, depressed mood, of course, inability to feel pleasure, which is one of the major things about depression. Change in weight or appetite. Sometimes you gain weight, sometimes you lose weight, sometimes you can't stop eating, sometimes you aren't eating at all, up to the point of anorexia. Sleep problems, you either sleep too much or you sleep too little. You may have insomnia where you can't fall asleep, and then when you do fall asleep, you can't wake up. So you'll sleep for an extended length of time. Psychomotor change usually is the fact that you slow down, everything slows down. Fatigue or loss of energy for depression. Feeling worthless or guilty. Having a difficult time concentrating. And being suicidal. Major depression. Now normally while they're in a depressive episode, they can't commit suicide because they don't have the energy to do it. And the problem, of course, is this is one of the things that you have to watch for if you're ever around an individual that is suffering from depression. It's when they start coming out of the depression. And we can talk about colors if you want. Being depressed is it's like everything is gray. But having major depressive disorder is like everything is turning black. And as long as everything is black, then the probability of being able to hurt yourself is fairly remote. But as soon as you start coming out and things start turning gray, then this is the time when these individuals will commit suicide. So this is a hint and a warning if you're ever around somebody that actually has major depressive disorder. It's when they seem to be recovering is when it's the most dangerous for them. So there you go. I went to Wabash College this past fall. The second game of the season, they beat a team that they potentially shouldn't have beaten. They were much smaller than the other team. That was on Saturday. They were celebrating on Saturday. On Sunday, everything was okay. On Monday, one of the stars of the game, the guy that had the most tackles, he was a linebacker, a little bitty guy. He's not very big, only weighed about 195 pounds. Committed suicide. He hung himself in his dorm room. Nobody knew. Nobody had a clue. Nobody had an inkling that this individual was suicidal. He had plans. He was a senior. He was going to become a nurse. He was learning how to speak Spanish so he could translate for Spanish-speaking people, and eventually, of course, he committed suicide. Now, the thing was that they said that he was depressed on Saturday night, but he was getting better on Sunday. And then on Monday, of course, they found him hanging in his closet. As strange as that may seem. So this is just something that you need to think about. We are psychologists. You will be a psychologist. And even if you don't go into counseling, of course, this is something that we need to be aware of. Suicide is around us all the time. People have suicidal thoughts. They may not be telling you about it, but if somebody is depressed, you need to keep an eye on it. Even if they're recovering, that's the most dangerous time, when they are recovering. So just keep that in mind. It's a tragedy when we lose somebody like that. So just a thought. Major depressive disorder has been found in all cultures that people have studied. Prevalence rates appear to vary depending on what type of culture it is. We see very few depressed people among Hispanics. But if we're talking about European Americans, we're talking about a relatively large portion of the population, somewhere between 15 and 20%, who are depressed. Depression prevalence rates vary in the United States based on diagnostic criteria. The rate in China is about 1/5 that observed in the West. So whereas we have 15 to 20%, China they have like 1%. Not nearly what it is in the United States. Now, why in the world would China have a lower rate than we have? Is it such a pleasant place in China?
Aren't they already kind of depressed?
I was just reading a book about China. And this lady had three babies, and they all died within a year of their birth. I know, this sounds awfully depressing. And then her husband died of tuberculosis. I'm thinking, oh my goodness gracious, that's terrible. Why wouldn't they be more depressed than we are?
They can control their emotions.
They do, and they will control their emotions in just about every instance. They're also a collectivist country, and this is not acceptable behavior. So in the United States, where all bets are off, we can do any damn thing we want. We can be depressed and we can commit suicide if we want, but that's just the way it is in the United States. In China, you're not allowed to be depressed. Everybody wants to know what's wrong with you. Everybody and their cousin comes along. Why don't you have a smile on your face? What's wrong with you? And pretty soon, of course, you put the smile on your face just so that people won't keep asking you what's wrong. One proposed rationale for this is due to two different manifestations of symptoms. Somatization, symptoms are primarily physiological, such as loss of appetite. Cyclization, symptoms are primarily psychological, such as depressed mood. So there is a question as to which is, I don't remember why I put the cat in there. There must be a reason. I don't do things just for no reason whatsoever. A cat. A puma. Many Chinese psychiatric patients are diagnosed with neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is poor appetite, headaches, insomnia, inability to concentrate. Of course, if we saw neurasthenia in the United States, we'd diagnose them with Major depressive disorder, of course. Neurasthenia was dropped from the DSM because symptoms were more physiological than psychological, and that's the reason that it dropped out of the DSM-5. Now the odd thing is that when I first started in psychology, we were working on the DSM-3. The DSM-3 was completely different than the DSM-5. We were in the DSM-3. So if you read an abnormal psychology book from the 1970s, like the one that I learned from, neurasthenia was one of the major things that you studied. We don't have that anymore. It's not even in the book anymore, as strange as that may seem. But in China, of course, there are a lot of people that are diagnosed with these physiological symptoms, as strange as that may seem. Some have argued that most Chinese neurasthenia actually qualifies for depression, even if only 9% of them report feeling depressed. So if you have these problems, poor appetite, headache, insomnia, inability to concentrate, in the United States we would probably diagnose that as depression. But in China, of course, they diagnose it as something totally different. But the reality is that the people that have these problems, they don't see themselves as depressed.
So they have depression in China, just,
It's the same stuff. Well, you saw the criteria.
yeah.
So you could have all physiological symptoms, and we would diagnose you as depressed. But in China, of course, that's neurasthenia. They don't diagnose depression nearly like we do. Okay, so it's a question of diagnosis. So that's the difference between here and there. Now the other problem is, if you go to China, they'll probably treat you with herbs or acupuncture. In the United States, we'll treat you with medication. We'll probably give you Prozac. We'll start out with Prozac. If that doesn't work, then we give you Paxil. If that doesn't work, then we give you Zoloft. We'll just keep hitting you with that stuff. And even if that doesn't work, we'll try tricyclic or monoamine oxidase inhibitor. We'll use some drug. It's easier that way. We don't have to do as much talking. And we can treat you in 5 minutes. Doctor comes in, doesn't even look in your face. You tell him what your problem is. He's already writing you a prescription. He hands you the prescription, still hasn't looked you in the face, and he walks out the door. That's the way it works in the United States.
So we can do that too. Just kidding.
Well, you're not doctors, so when you become a psychologist, of course, you'll want to talk to these people because that's how you get paid. But of course, that doctor is being paid by how many clients he has, how many patients he has. Social anxiety disorder is a fear of acting in an inept and unacceptable manner, leading to negative social consequences. Research has shown that East Asians exhibit more social anxiety symptoms than European Americans. Accordingly, evidence suggests that interdependence is associated with heightened social anxiety. However, social anxiety is less documented in East Asian countries. They have a morbid fear of being different. Remember Hikikomori, the Japanese problem. That's not the only one. There's many social anxieties that they have that we don't have in the United States. If we had a kid that was suffering from Hikikomori, well, first of all, we wouldn't call it a problem because 2/3 of all teenage boys are holed up in their room playing video games. And that's the problem here. They're collecting pictures of anime or something. I mean, if we look at Big Bang Theory, I mean, all those guys have those problems. They collect toys and don't even open them to play with them. They just collect them. I know, they're collectibles. And they play video games. And they play video games ad nauseum. They'll play for extended lengths of time. If you see, I've watched all the episodes. There was an episode where they were making this deal. They were going to spend the whole weekend playing a video game. And they did. They spent the whole weekend playing a video game. Can you imagine?
Didn't they say no girls allowed and
This is, I think it was somebody's girlfriend.
Howie?
Howard?
Howard, yes.
Yeah. Oh, Howard was married at the time, wasn't he? And he lied to his wife about where he was going. And eventually, his mother came and visited, maybe, if I remember correctly. I don't know. Okay. But this is normal behavior. This is what we see as normal behavior. If your child played a video game for 12 hours straight, would you say anything? Thank goodness he wasn't harassing you to go to the mall or something. Potentially. But in East Asia, of course, this is not common. Why don't we stop right here, because I have to leave. Why don't we stop right here, and we'll pick this up next time. We'll talk more about Hikikomori and all the problems that people have, all the fun stuff.